At Sunrise Café, a cozy coffee shop in the heart of Cedar Grove, what began as a simple extortion attempt transformed into one of the most extraordinary tales of justice and redemption ever witnessed. When the ruthless Red Hand crew targeted a seemingly defenseless single mother, they never expected to cross paths with Marcus "Iron" Sullivan, a legendary Marine Force Recon staff sergeant with over a decade of combat experience, who would teach them that true strength lies not in intimidation, but in protecting what matters most. The early morning sun filtered through the large windows of Sunrise Café, casting warm shadows across the freshly polished wooden floors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Grace Sullivan moved with practiced efficiency behind the counter, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries filling the air. Her hands worked methodically, preparing the day's first batch of her famous cinnamon rolls, a recipe that had helped transform this small corner shop into one of Cedar Grove's most beloved establishments. The familiar chime of her phone interrupted the morning's peaceful rhythm. A smile crossed her face as she recognized the caller ID. Marcus, her brother, always checked in at this hour when he was consulting on security operations overseas. "Hey, big brother," she said, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder while continuing to knead dough. "You're up early." Static crackled across the line, highlighting the miles between them. "Just making sure my favorite sister's okay. Kelly get to school all right?" Grace glanced at the framed photo on the wall. Marcus in his dress blues, the Marine Corps emblem gleaming proudly. Next to it, a more recent picture showed her 12-year-old daughter Kelly's winning moment at the state science fair. Sarah Cooper gave her a ride. You know how the sergeant loves to spoil her favorite student. A distant sound caught Grace's attention. Multiple vehicles approaching, their engines carrying a menacing rumble unusual for this quiet neighborhood. Through the morning mist, she could make out several black SUVs moving with calculated precision. "Everything okay there, Gracie?" Marcus's voice shifted subtly, the trained operator in him picking up on his sister's momentary silence. "Just some early morning traffic," Grace replied, watching as men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicles. Their casual demeanor couldn't hide the predatory grace of their movements. The leader, tall and sharp-featured, surveyed the cafe with cold calculation. "Though I might have some interesting customers coming in." "Grace." Marcus's tone changed completely, professional and alert. "What's really going on?" The bell above the door chimed as Dominic "Ghost" Kovalev pushed it open, his expensive suit failing to hide the hardened criminal beneath. Behind him, Leo "Razor" Torres's lean frame blocked the entrance while Tyler "Beast" Morrison's massive bulk took position near the windows. "I should go," Grace said calmly, though her heart raced. "The morning rush is starting. Love you, Marcus." "Grace, wait." She ended the call, sliding the phone into her apron pocket. The early morning regulars, mostly local workers and retired cops like Mike Dawson, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Through the window, she could see Detective Maya Chen's unmarked car slowing as it passed, the detective's expression hardening as she assessed the situation. "Mrs. Sullivan," Kovalev smiled, the expression never reaching his steel-gray eyes. "Your cafe's reputation for excellent coffee precedes you, though I suspect you know we're not here for the cinnamon rolls." Grace continued her work, her movements deliberately calm despite the tension filling her small cafe. "Unless you're here to place an order, we're not quite open yet." Her voice remained steady, years of raising a daughter alone having taught her to stay strong in the face of intimidation. Kovalev moved closer, his perfectly polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "Cedar Grove is changing, Mrs. Sullivan. New opportunities are arising and smart business owners know when to adapt." He gestured around the cafe. "This is prime real estate. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to such a charming establishment." Through the windows, Grace could see more men taking positions around the block. In the distance, Mike Dawson was already on his phone, likely calling his old police contacts. But the station was 15 minutes away. She needed to handle this situation herself. "Not interested," Grace replied firmly, meeting Kovalev's gaze. "This cafe's been my dream for 10 years. We do just fine on our own. Beast, Kovalev's voice carried an edge of irritation. Show Mrs. Sullivan what happens to local businesses that don't appreciate our protection services. Tyler Morrison grinned, cracking his knuckles as he moved toward the display case filled with freshly baked goods. But before he could reach it, Grace's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Mr. Kovalev, she said calmly, perhaps you should do your homework before making threats. Her hand slipped into her pocket, activating the silent alarm system Marcus had insisted on installing. You might find some interesting reading about what happened to the last crew that tried to muscle in on Cedar Grove. The morning sun continued to rise over the quiet town, unaware that in a small coffee shop, a line was being drawn. A single mother stood her ground against men who had built their reputation on fear and violence, not knowing that her quiet defiance would set in motion events that would change everything. The morning sun continued to rise over the quiet town, unaware that in a small coffee shop, a line was being drawn. A single mother stood her ground against men who had built their reputation on fear and violence, not knowing that her quiet defiance would set in motion events that would change everything. In the distance, sirens began their faint wail, but Grace knew that what was coming would be far more significant than local law enforcement. The game was about to change, and the Red Hand crew was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person to threaten isn't the one who fights back. It's the one who has nothing left to lose but everything to protect. Far from the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, Marcus Sullivan sat rigid in his private security office, the phone still clutched in his hand. 15 years of Marine Force Recon experience had taught him to read between the lines, to sense danger in the smallest details. The rumble of multiple vehicles, his sister's too casual dismissal, the forced lightness in her voice, everything screamed immediate threat. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up local contacts, surveillance feeds, anything that could give him eyes on the situation. The morning security consultation could wait. Nothing mattered more than family. He'd trained countless operators, led dozens of high-risk missions in the world's most dangerous places, but nothing had prepared him for the ice-cold fear that gripped him now. Sarah Cooper's number was first on his call list. The police sergeant had been keeping an eye on Grace and Kelly ever since Marcus helped her deal with a human trafficking ring 2 years ago. But before he could dial, his office door opened. Captain Jack Rivera entered, immediately tensing at the expression on his former Marine's face. The years they'd spent together in Force Recon had taught him to read Marcus like a book. What's wrong? Cancel everything. Marcus's voice carried the quiet authority that had made him legendary among the Marines. Get me a secure line to Cedar Grove Police Department, specifically Detective Chen. And Jack, he paused, his eyes never leaving the computer screen. We might need the team. Back at Sunrise Café, Dominic Kovalev circled the counter, his Italian leather shoes leaving deliberate scuff marks on Grace's pristine floor. She watched him with the same steady gaze she'd used to weather a decade of single parenthood, her hand still resting near the emergency button in her pocket. You know what impresses me, Mrs. Sullivan? Kovalev ran a finger along the spotless display case, studying the artfully arranged pastries. Your reputation in this community. Everyone respects you. Everyone listens to you. His smile turned predatory. That could be very useful to our organization. Leo Torres laughed, the sound sharp in the quiet cafe. Lady, you don't get it. We're not asking for help. We're telling you how it's going to be. Through the windows, Grace could see more Red Hand members taking positions along the street. Mike Dawson was still on his phone, his face pale as he spoke urgently to someone. Detective Chen's unmarked car had disappeared, but Grace knew the detective well enough to know she was already coordinating a response. The morning light cast strange shadows across the cafe's interior as Tyler Morrison began systematically knocking items off shelves, sending coffee beans and specialty teas crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass punctuated each deliberate act of destruction. Shame about your inventory, Kovalev said softly. Small businesses face so many accidents these days. Sometimes they're catastrophic. Grace watched her carefully curated shelves being destroyed, years of hard work scattered across the floor. Her voice, when it came, carried a steel that made Kovalev pause. My brother once taught me something about bullies, she said quietly. They mistake kindness for weakness, patience for fear. Your brother? Kovalev's eyebrows raised mockingly. The one overseas? What's he going to do from halfway around the world? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the Cedar Grove police station, Detective Maya Chen's morning coffee crashed to the floor as Marcus Sullivan's voice came through her secure line. The situation he described made her blood run cold. "How many?" she demanded, already signaling to Sergeant Cooper. "At least 8 visible, probably more in reserve," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the controlled tension she remembered from their joint operations against the cartels. "Red Hand crew, led by Dominic Kovalev. They have connections to Eastern European organized crime. You need to get to my sister's cafe now." Chen's face paled. "Jesus, Marcus. Red Hand? They've been trying to establish territory here for months. I've got 3 units available, maybe 15 minutes out. Not good enough, Maya." Marcus's voice dropped lower. "You know what they do to businesses that resist them. And Grace, she won't back down. You know how she is." Back at the cafe, Grace watched as Kovalev's men continued their systematic destruction. Through the windows, she could see concerned locals gathering, kept at bay by Red Hand members who had positioned themselves strategically around the building. Her fingers tightened on the counter's edge, the only sign of her rising anger. "Think about your customers," Kovalev suggested, his voice almost gentle. "Loyal people, been coming here for years. Be a shame if something happened to them, if they got caught in the middle of unfortunate events." Grace's mind flashed to Kelly's photo on the wall. Everything she'd built for her daughter. But she'd also built it on principles, on showing Kelly that you don't bow to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem. "Are you threatening my customers now?" Her voice remained level, though her heart raced with maternal fury. "Just explaining how things work." Kovalev leaned closer, invading her space. "Strong survive. Weak learn to bend or they break." Just explaining how things work. Kovalev leaned closer, invading her space. "Strong survive. Weak learn to bend or they break." In his office, Marcus was already in motion, his mind racing through scenarios, options, and contingencies. His voice carried absolute authority as he issued rapid-fire orders through multiple channels. "Maya, listen carefully. I've got assets in the area, former Marines who owe me favors. They can be there in 20 minutes. The FBI has a task force tracking Red Hand," Chen offered, "but they're 3 hours out at best." "My sister doesn't have 3 hours." Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, coordinating resources, calling in markers. "Listen carefully, there's something about that cafe you need to understand." "What's that?" "It's not just a business." Marcus's voice hardened. "It's my sister's dream, her daughter's future, and they just threatened the wrong family." The morning light continued to stream through Sunrise Cafe's windows, illuminating a scene that would soon transform from simple intimidation into something none of them could have anticipated. The game was about to change, and Cedar Grove would never be the same. The morning fog was beginning to lift over Cedar Grove, revealing more black SUVs arriving, their occupants taking up strategic positions along the quiet streets surrounding Sunrise Cafe. Inside, Grace Sullivan watched as Dominic Kovalev picked up the framed photo of Kelly from the counter, studying it with calculated interest. "Lovely daughter," he remarked, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "Science fair winner, I see. Bright future ahead of her." The implied threat hung heavy in the air as he deliberately let the frame slip from his fingers, the glass shattering on impact. Grace looked down at her daughter's smiling face among the broken glass, remembering countless conversations with Marcus about standing up to bullies, about doing things the right way, about the difference between justice and retribution. When she raised her eyes to meet Kovalev's, something in her gaze made him step back. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" she asked quietly. Kovalev's smile faltered slightly. "Do tell." "You assumed because I was alone I would be afraid." Grace's voice carried the strength of years spent protecting her child, building her business from nothing, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. But you don't know anything about this town, about my family, about what real strength looks like." As if in answer to her words, sirens began to wail in the distance, multiple units converging on their location. Kovalev's head snapped up, his face darkening as he recognized the sound of approaching law enforcement. "Beast," he barked sharply. "Time to send a clearer message." Tyler Morrison grinned, cracking his knuckles as he moved toward Grace. But before he could take another step, a new sound cut through the morning air. The distinctive thrum of military helicopters approaching from the direction of the private airfield. In his office, Marcus Sullivan coordinated the response with cold efficiency. Captain Rivera watched in amazement as years of carefully gathered intelligence on the Red Hand organization began flowing to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. "Sir," Rivera said quietly, "you've been preparing for this." Marcus's eyes never left his screens. "The moment they started moving into Cedar Grove, I knew it was just a matter of time. Grace would never back down, never let them establish a foothold. So I started building files, making connections, putting pieces in place. At the Café, the situation was rapidly deteriorating for the Red Hand crew. More police units arrived, including state troopers. Through the windows, Grace could see Detective Chen coordinating with Sergeant Cooper, their movements precise and practiced. "Boss," Leo Torres called out, his earlier confidence evaporating. "This ain't right. Local cops don't move like this. This is coordinated." Kovalev's face contorted with rage. He grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her roughly around the counter. "Maybe, but if we're going down, you're coming with us as insurance." The moment Kovalev laid hands on her, something changed in Grace's demeanor. Marcus had taught her more than just how to use emergency buttons and secure phones. Her movement was swift, practiced. A simple self-defense technique that sent Kovalev staggering backward, unprepared for resistance from someone he'd dismissed as helpless. "That," she said calmly, "was your final mistake." The cafe's door burst open as Detective Chen led the entry team, their movements coordinated with military precision. Outside, former Marines who'd served with Marcus had already taken up strategic positions, ensuring no one slipped through the perimeter. In his office, Marcus watched the feed with cold satisfaction as the Red Hand members were systematically disarmed and arrested. Captain Rivera studied his expression, seeing not just a security consultant executing a flawless operation, but a brother protecting his family. "You know," Rivera said thoughtfully, "they never had a chance, did they?" The morning sun finally burned through the last of the fog, illuminating Cedar Grove as it bore witness to the dismantling of one of the East Coast's most notorious criminal organizations. But this was more than just a law enforcement victory. It was proof that sometimes the quiet strength of a single mother, backed by the love of a warrior brother, could stand against any threat. Through his surveillance feeds, Marcus watched as Grace calmly began cleaning up her café, her movements showing no sign of the trauma she'd just endured. That's when his phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "Still coming for Sunday dinner? Kelly's making your favorite cookies." Marcus smiled, knowing that in Cedar Grove, family meant everything. And the Red Hand crew had just learned what happened when you threatened the wrong family. Marcus smiled, knowing that in Cedar Grove, family meant everything. And the Red Hand crew had just learned what happened when you threatened the wrong family. At the Cedar Grove police station, the holding cells were filling up quickly. Dominic Kovalev sat alone in an interrogation room, his designer suit now wrinkled, his composed facade crumbling as he watched his organization begin to collapse through the two-way mirror. Detective Chen stood with Sergeant Cooper, reviewing the preliminary reports with growing amazement. "The intelligence package Marcus put together," Chen muttered, flipping through pages. "This isn't just about protecting his sister. It's a comprehensive breakdown of Red Hand's entire operation. Money laundering, extortion, international connections. This goes deeper than we thought." "Sir," a young officer interrupted, tablet in hand. "FBI just arrived, and you're going to want to see this. Leo Torres is talking." In the adjacent interrogation room, Leo Razor Torres sat straight-backed, his street swagger replaced with military bearing. The FBI agent across from him reviewed his file with raised eyebrows. "Army Rangers, 2 tours in Iraq," the agent read. Bronze star with valor. How does someone like you end up running enforcement for Red Hand? Torres stared at his hands, telling stories of choices he'd rather forget. Got lost after getting out. Couldn't adjust to civilian life. The crew. They offered structure, purpose. At least that's what I thought I was joining. The morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Grove, illuminating a town that had changed fundamentally in just a few hours. At Sunrise Café, Grace Sullivan continued her work, serving coffee to a mix of regular customers and law enforcement officers, her quiet strength and inspiration to everyone who witnessed that morning's events. In the bustling interrogation area of Cedar Grove Police Station, Dominic Kovalev's world was unraveling faster than anyone could have anticipated. The man who had built his reputation on cold calculation and merciless efficiency now sat alone, watching his empire crumble through the reflection in the two-way mirror. Detective Maya Chen studied him from the observation room, her experienced eyes noting every crack in his composed facade. "The money trails are incredible," she told Sergeant Cooper, spreading financial documents across the table. Shell companies, offshore accounts, connections to Eastern European crime syndicates. Marcus didn't just build a case, he gave us a roadmap to their entire operation. Down the hall, Leo Torres continued his revelation to the FBI agents, his story painting a picture of an organization far more sophisticated than local law enforcement had imagined. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he explained, his military bearing showing through despite years of hiding it. "When I joined, they talked about building legitimate businesses, helping veterans find their feet. Instead, they turned us into exactly what we fought against overseas." At Sunrise Café, Grace Sullivan supervised the cleanup effort with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else in her life. Local volunteers had showed up without being asked, helping to repair the damage from the morning's confrontation. Through the window, she could see Mike Dawson organizing other veterans from the neighborhood, their presence a subtle reminder that this community protected its own. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "All secure. Kelly's school has been notified. Sarah's keeping her safe at the station until we're certain every Red Hand associate is accounted for." "You okay?" Grace smiled, typing back, "Never better. Though you might want to explain why there's a Marine Force Recon team disguised as construction workers across the street." In his private security office, Marcus Sullivan coordinated with multiple agencies as the operation expanded beyond Cedar Grove's boundaries. Captain Rivera studied the evidence boards they'd constructed, each connection revealing another layer of criminal enterprise. "Sir," Rivera reported, reviewing real-time updates, "we're getting movement in 3 other cities. Red Hand cells are scrambling, trying to destroy evidence. But our teams were ready. They're picking them up as we speak." Marcus nodded, his attention focused on surveillance feeds showing more arrests being made across the state. "They thought hitting a small-town cafe would be simple. Instead, they gave us the opening we needed to take down their entire network." At the police station, Detective Chen's team was processing a steady stream of Red Hand members, many of them already offering information in exchange for consideration. The veteran contingent, in particular, seemed eager to break ties with the organization. "You know what the hardest part was?" Torres asked the FBI agent, his voice heavy with regret, watching them turn good soldiers into thugs. Kovalev didn't want warriors. He wanted weapons. He found guys who were lost after service, promised them purpose, brotherhood. Instead, he twisted everything we stood for. Grace's Café had become an impromptu command center as local law enforcement coordinated with federal agencies. She moved among the officers and agents, serving coffee and her famous cinnamon rolls, her calm presence a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. "Mrs. Sullivan," a young officer approached hesitantly. "My brother served with Staff Sergeant Sullivan in Afghanistan. He always said your brother was the kind of Marine who never left anyone behind. Guess he still lives by that code." Through the cafe's windows, Grace watched as more federal vehicles arrived, their presence drawing curious onlookers. But the town's residents went about their business with quiet determination, sending a clear message that Cedar Grove wouldn't be intimidated. In the investigation room, Detective Chen received another update that made her eyebrows raise. "Marcus, are you seeing this? The financial records we seized, they're showing connections to corrupted officials in 3 states. Red Hand wasn't just a criminal organization, they were building a power structure. That's why they targeted Cedar Grove, Marcus replied through the secure line. They needed legitimate businesses as fronts. They saw a single mom running a successful cafe, thought she'd be an easy mark. They never understood what they were really walking into. Grace continued serving customers as federal agents processed evidence in her back office. Each time the bell above the door chimed, more locals arrived offering support. This wasn't just about protecting a business anymore. It was about a community standing together. Sarah Cooper arrived with Kelly, the young girl running to hug her mother tightly. "Mom, Aunt Sarah said you took down bad guys, just like Uncle Marcus." Grace held her daughter close, catching Detective Chen's eye over Kelly's head. Both women shared a knowing look. Sometimes the strongest warriors weren't the ones in uniform, but the ones who fought everyday battles with quiet determination. Outside, Cedar Grove continued its daily routine, though now there was a new awareness in the air. Red Hand had sought to rule through fear and intimidation, but instead, they'd awakened something far more powerful: a community's resolve to protect its own. The late morning sun streamed through the windows of Cedar Grove Police Station's command center, where Detective Maya Chen coordinated with federal agencies as the operation expanded beyond their quiet town. On her screens, surveillance feeds showed similar raids happening across 3 states, the carefully constructed criminal empire of Red Hand crumbling in real time. "Sir," a young officer rushed in, tablet in hand. "We just got intel from the FBI task force. They found something bigger in Kovalev's private servers. This isn't just about local extortion. They were building infrastructure for international operations." In his private security office, Marcus Sullivan studied the encrypted files his team had recovered. Captain Rivera stood at his shoulder, watching as years of carefully gathered intelligence began painting a picture far darker than they'd initially suspected. "The cafe was just the beginning," Marcus explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Cedar Grove was meant to be their prototype, a small town turned into a laundering hub. They targeted Grace because they needed legitimate businesses with strong community ties." Rivera nodded grimly. "And who better than a single mom running a successful local cafe? They thought she'd be desperate enough to cooperate, established enough to be useful." Instead, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. They found something they didn't expect: a community that doesn't break. At Sunrise Café, Grace supervised the continued cleanup while maintaining her regular service. The morning's events hadn't stopped the lunch rush, and her regulars made a point of showing up in greater numbers than usual. Through the windows, she could see plainclothes officers maintaining discreet surveillance, their presence a reminder that the danger hadn't completely passed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Kelly. "Mom, Aunt Sarah's teaching me self-defense moves like Uncle Marcus showed you. Can we install a cool alarm system in my room too?" Before Grace could respond, Detective Chen's voice caught her attention. "Grace, we need to talk about what we found on Kovalev's laptop. Your cafe wasn't randomly chosen. They've been watching you for months." Grace continued wiping down the counter, her movements deliberate and calm. "I had a feeling. Too many new customers taking photos, asking about my business model, suggesting franchising opportunities. They built detailed files on 20 local businesses," Chen explained, spreading photographs across the counter. "But you were their primary target. They thought a woman alone would be easy to intimidate," Grace finished. "They forgot that single mothers learn to be strong out of necessity." In the station's interrogation room, Leo Torres was providing details that made even seasoned federal agents uncomfortable. "Kovalev had a system," he explained. "Find businesses with strong community connections, apply pressure until they broke, then use them to legitimize larger operations. But it wasn't just about money laundering. They were building power bases, collecting information, creating networks of compromised people they could control." Marcus coordinated with his team as more evidence emerged. Former Marines who'd served under him now worked alongside federal agents, their military training proving invaluable in tracking Red Hand's operations. "Commander," Captain Rivera reported, "we're seeing movement in other towns similar to Cedar Grove. Small communities, strategic locations, vulnerable businesses being targeted. It's a pattern." Then we use their pattern against them, Marcus replied, his tactical mind already forming plans. They wanted to use my sister's cafe as their starting point. Instead, we're going to use it as ground zero for dismantling their entire operation. Grace's phone buzzed again, this time with a series of messages from other local business owners. Word had spread about her stand against Red Hand, and the community was rallying. Restaurant owners offered to help restock her supplies. The local hardware store volunteered to repair her damaged fixtures, and retired veterans organized informal security patrols. Detective Chen watched the community's response with growing appreciation. "You know what Kovalev never understood about small towns?" she asked Grace. "They're not weak because they're small. They're strong because they stand together." Through the cafe's windows, Grace could see more federal vehicles arriving, their presence drawing curious onlookers. But unlike the morning's fear, there was now a sense of determination in the air. Cedar Grove was changing, not in the way Red Hand had intended, but into something stronger. Sarah Cooper arrived with another update, her police sergeant's badge catching the sunlight. "We've identified Red Hand cells in 5 other towns across the state. Marcus's intel is giving us everything we need to take them down before they can establish footholds." Grace nodded, preparing another pot of coffee for the growing number of law enforcement personnel using her cafe as an impromptu command center. "They thought they could use us," she said quietly. "They never realized we'd end up using them instead." Outside, Cedar Grove continued its daily routine, though now there was a new awareness in the air. What Red Hand had intended as their first conquest had become the beginning of their downfall, all because they'd underestimated the quiet strength of a single mother and the community that stood behind her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Sunrise Cafe's windows as Grace watched her town transform. This wasn't just about surviving a threat anymore. It was about showing others how to stand against intimidation. Sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in having power, but in knowing how to turn an enemy's power against them. As the afternoon progressed, the scale of what Red Hand had been planning began to emerge. In the police station's main conference room, now converted into a joint task force headquarters, Detective Chen reviewed evidence boards that covered entire walls. Each connection revealed another layer of a criminal enterprise that had been poised to swallow Cedar Grove whole. "The financial trails are staggering," she told Marcus through their secure line. "Shell companies nested within shell companies, offshore accounts linked to legitimate businesses, political donations through seemingly clean intermediaries. They weren't just building a criminal operation, they were creating an infrastructure for long-term control." In his security office, Marcus studied real-time updates from teams deployed across 3 states. Captain Rivera coordinated with former Marines now working alongside federal agents, their military precision bringing a new level of effectiveness to the operation. "Sir," Rivera reported, "we're getting movement from other Red Hand cells. They're trying to go dark, burning documents, closing accounts. But we were ready. Teams are moving in at all identified locations." Through the cafe's windows, Grace watched as more federal vehicles arrived. The initial fear that had gripped Cedar Grove had transformed into something else, a quiet determination that seemed to spread from person to person. Local business owners stopped by regularly, some bringing supplies to replace what had been destroyed, others simply showing solidarity. Mike Dawson, the retired cop who'd been one of her first customers, organized other veterans into informal patrols. They moved through town with practiced casualness, their presence both a warning to any remaining Red Hand members and a reassurance to the community. Mrs. Sullivan, a young FBI agent, approached her counter. "We need to discuss what we found in Kovalev's personal files. Your cafe wasn't just randomly selected. They had detailed surveillance, months of monitoring. They knew about Kelly's science fair wins, your brother's military service, even your daily routines." Grace continued serving customers, her movements precise and unhurried. "They watched us, studied us, thought they knew us," she replied calmly. "But they only saw what they wanted to see." In the interrogation room, Leo Torres provided insights that transformed the investigation's scope. "Kovalev had this theory about small towns," he explained to federal agents. "Said they were like pressure points. Find the right spot, apply the right force, and you can control the whole body. Cedar Grove was supposed to be their proof of concept. Detective Chen's team worked methodically through seized documents and devices. Each piece of evidence revealed more about Red Hand's ambitious plans. They had everything mapped out, she told Marcus. After the cafe, they were going to target the hardware store, then the local bank. Within 6 months, they would have owned half the commercial property in town. Instead, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction, they gave us everything we needed to dismantle their entire organization. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy walks into willingly. Sarah Cooper arrived with Kelly, the young girl's eyes widening at the transformation of her mother's cafe into a law enforcement command center. "Mom!" she called out excitedly. "Did you really take down a whole criminal organization with coffee and cinnamon rolls?" Grace hugged her daughter close, sharing a knowing look with Detective Chen. "Sometimes the strongest defense isn't in fighting back," she told Kelly. "It's in standing your ground and letting your enemies make mistakes." Through secure channels, Marcus coordinated the expanding operation. Red Hand's attempt to intimidate a single mother had exposed vulnerabilities in their entire network. Federal agents were moving on properties across the region, each raid providing new intelligence that led to more targets. "Commander," Rivera reported, "we're seeing a pattern in their operations. They specifically targeted businesses run by people they thought would be vulnerable. Single parents, recent immigrants, veterans struggling to restart their lives. They weren't just looking for fronts, they were looking for people they thought they could control." Grace's phone buzzed with messages from other business owners in nearby towns, sharing stories of similar approaches from Red Hand representatives. What had started as a local incident was revealing itself as part of a systematic campaign of intimidation and control. Outside Sunrise Café, Cedar Grove continued its daily routine, though now there was a new awareness in every interaction. Red Hand had meant to use this town's close-knit nature against it, to exploit the connections between neighbors for their own purposes. Instead, they'd learned that true community bonds couldn't be corrupted or controlled. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows as Grace prepared for the evening rush. Despite the day's events, or perhaps because of them, more customers than usual filled the tables. Each person who came through her door sent a clear message. Cedar Grove stood together. Detective Chen watched the scene with professional appreciation. "You know what amazes me?" she asked Grace. "They thought they were so clever, targeting a single mom's cafe. They never realized they were walking into a trap baited with coffee and courage." Grace smiled, serving another round of fresh coffee to the law enforcement personnel who had made her cafe their temporary headquarters. The day's events had transformed more than just her business. They had revealed the true strength of quiet determination and unwavering principle. In the late afternoon light, the interrogation rooms of Cedar Grove Police Station buzzed with activity as federal agents pieced together the full scope of Red Hand's operation. Dominic Kovalev sat alone in the primary interview room, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his composed facade cracking as hours of questioning revealed the true extent of what they'd uncovered. "You have no idea what you've started," he snarled at the federal agents. "The people I work for, they don't forgive mistakes. Cedar Grove will burn for this." But his threats carried less weight with each passing hour as more members of his organization came forward, trading information for consideration. Marcus Sullivan coordinated operations from his security office, his screens displaying an intricate web of criminal connections that centered around Red Hand. Captain Rivera watched as years of carefully gathered intelligence began paying dividends. "Sir," Rivera said, studying a financial report, "these business records implicate officials in 3 major cities. The corruption goes deeper than anyone suspected." Marcus nodded grimly. Red Hand was just the visible part. Beneath them was a network of corrupt officials, compromised law enforcement, legitimate businesses turned into fronts. Pull this thread hard enough, and the whole tapestry unravels. At Sunrise Café, Grace maintained her regular service, while federal agents processed evidence in her back office. Through the windows, she could see more suspicious vehicles arriving, expensive cars with tinted windows that screamed organized crime. But now, each vehicle was quietly intercepted by law enforcement before it could get close. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Chen approached with fresh intelligence. "We've got movement from higher up their organization. The people above Kovalov, they're sending cleanup crews, professional contractors." Grace continued wiping down tables, her movements unhurried. "They still don't understand, do they? They think this is about a cafe, about a small town they can intimidate or burn down. They don't see what they're really facing." In the secondary interrogation room, Leo Torres continued providing information that transformed the investigation's scope. "It wasn't just about money laundering or protection rackets," he explained. "They were building something bigger. Every compromised business, every corrupted official was part of a larger plan. They wanted to create a shadow infrastructure, hidden in plain sight." Sarah Cooper arrived with urgent news. "Marcus, we've got confirmation. 3 teams of professional contractors just checked into hotels around Cedar Grove. These aren't street thugs. They're former special forces, mercenaries." Through secure channels, Marcus coordinated responses with his network of former Marines. "They think they can solve this with force," he told Captain Rivera. "They don't realize they've already lost the most important battle, the one for the community's soul." Grace's phone buzzed with messages from throughout the town. Local business owners reported suspicious customers, obvious surveillance attempts, subtle threats. But instead of cowering, the community responded with quiet determination. Shop owners kept each other informed, residents reported suspicious vehicles, and veterans maintained casual but vigilant presence on street corners. "You see what's happening?" Grace asked Detective Chen, nodding toward the street where neighbors checked on each other with practiced casualness. "They wanted to use our connections against us, turn neighbor against neighbor. Instead, they've made us stronger." In the command center, federal agents processed intelligence from multiple sources. Each piece of evidence revealed more about the organization that had thought it could swallow Cedar Grove whole. Professional contractors found their careful surveillance met with counter-surveillance, their tactical advantages nullified by a community that refused to be intimidated. "Commander," Rivera reported, "we're tracking multiple teams moving into position around town. They're professional, coordinated. But something's wrong. They can't establish proper surveillance points. Everywhere they try to set up, there's already someone watching." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "That's because they're fighting the wrong battle. They came prepared for tactical warfare, but they're facing something they don't understand. A community that's been preparing for this moment without even knowing it." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as more suspicious vehicles arrived, only to find themselves subtly boxed in by local traffic, their movements constrained by a town that knew its own streets better than any outsider. Each attempted intimidation was met with quiet resistance, each threat countered by community solidarity. "Mom," Kelly called from her homework spot at the counter. "Mr. Dawson says there are bad guys watching our house, but he says not to worry because the whole neighborhood is watching them back." Grace squeezed her daughter's hand, sharing a knowing look with Detective Chen. The professional contractors sent to clean up Red Hand's mess were about to learn what Kovalov had discovered the hard way. Sometimes the strongest defense isn't in weapons or tactics, but in the unshakable bonds between neighbors. As evening approached, Cedar Grove transformed its daily routines into subtle acts of resistance. Each regular customer who came to the cafe sent a message. Each neighbor who walked their dog past suspicious vehicles took mental notes. Each veteran who sat reading a newspaper on their porch maintained discreet surveillance. The professional contractors found themselves facing something their tactical training hadn't prepared them for. A town where every resident was a potential sensor, every business a potential observation post, and every friendly conversation could be carrying intelligence to law enforcement. What had started as an attempt to intimidate a single mother had evolved into something unprecedented. A community-wide demonstration of what happens when criminals mistake small-town values for weakness. Cedar Grove was about to teach them an expensive lesson about the true nature of strength. The evening sun cast long shadows across Cedar Grove as the professional contractors hired by Red Hand's leadership attempted to establish surveillance positions throughout the town. What should have been a routine operation for these experienced operators was turning into a tactical nightmare, as every seemingly perfect observation point turned out to be already occupied by alert residents. In the command center, Marcus Sullivan tracked their movements through a combination of surveillance feeds and real-time reports from his network of former Marines. Captain Rivera coordinated with multiple teams, each one reporting the same strange phenomenon. The contractors couldn't establish proper coverage of their targets. "Sir," Rivera reported, studying tactical displays, "these guys are good. Former special forces, private military contractors, experienced surveillance specialists. But they can't get clean lines of sight on any of their objectives. It's like the whole town is working against them." Marcus nodded, watching as another team of contractors found their carefully chosen position blocked by an impromptu neighborhood barbecue. They came prepared for a tactical operation. Instead, they're facing something they've never trained for: a community that turns normal life into a defensive strategy. At Sunrise Café, Grace continued serving the evening crowd while Detective Chen coordinated with federal agents. Through the windows, she could see the frustrated contractors trying to maintain surveillance, only to have their views consistently blocked by delivery trucks, gathering neighbors, and casual pedestrians who somehow always managed to be in the wrong place at the right time. "Mrs. Sullivan," a young FBI agent approached with fresh intelligence, "we've identified 3 separate teams of contractors. They're trying to map out escape routes, identify security vulnerabilities. But they're reporting strange difficulties. They can't maintain consistent observation." Grace smiled, serving fresh coffee to a group of veterans who had made her cafe their regular evening meeting spot. "That's because they're looking for weaknesses that don't exist. They see a small town and think they understand it. They don't realize that every person here is part of something bigger." In the police station's interrogation room, Leo Torres provided insights that helped explain the contractors' frustration. "Red Hand made the same mistake I did when I first joined them," he explained to federal agents. "We saw small towns as soft targets. We never understood that close-knit communities have their own kind of strength." Sarah Cooper arrived with updated intelligence from her patrol. "The contractors are getting sloppy, making mistakes. They're used to operating in environments where people mind their own business. Instead, they've got grandmothers calling in their license plates, kids on bikes tracking their movements, and veterans noting their tactical patterns." Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as the contractors' frustration grew. "They're trained to deal with active resistance," he explained to Captain Rivera. "But they have no protocol for handling a town where every casual interaction could be carrying intelligence, where every friendly wave might be a signal." Grace's phone buzzed with messages from throughout Cedar Grove. Shopkeepers reporting suspicious customers, neighbors alerting each other to unusual vehicles, parents coordinating after-school activities to ensure no child was ever alone. What looked like normal small-town life to the observers was actually a sophisticated network of community awareness. "You know what's really extraordinary?" Detective Chen asked Grace, watching the scene unfold. None of this was planned. There was no training, no preparation. The town just naturally adapted, turning its normal patterns into a defensive network. In their hotel rooms, the contractors filed increasingly frustrated reports to their handlers. Every attempt to establish surveillance was met with casual but effective interference. Traditional tactical advantages meant nothing in an environment where everyday life had become a form of resistance. "Commander," Rivera reported, monitoring communications, "they're calling for reinforcements. They don't understand why they can't get clean intelligence. Their tactical playbook isn't working." Marcus allowed himself a moment of professional appreciation. "That's because they're reading the situation wrong. They see random interference, uncoordinated civilian activity. What they're actually facing is a community that's turned its daily routine into a defense strategy." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as another team of contractors tried to set up surveillance, only to find their position blocked by an impromptu youth soccer practice. Each failed attempt revealed another layer of the community's unconscious coordination. "Mom," Kelly observed from her homework spot, "Mr. Dawson says the bad guys can't figure out how we're stopping them. But we're not doing anything special, are we? We're just being normal." Grace shared a knowing look with Detective Chen. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the best defense isn't in doing anything special. It's in being exactly who you are." As night began to fall, Cedar Grove continued its evening routines, each normal activity unconsciously contributing to the community's defense. Book clubs became intelligence-sharing meetings, evening walks turned into patrol routes, and friendly gatherings served as surveillance countermeasures. The professional contractors, trained to deal with active opposition, found themselves helpless against a form of resistance they couldn't combat. The natural solidarity of a small town where everyone knew everyone else, where unusual activity was instantly noticed and casually countered, and where the simple act of being a community had become the strongest possible defense. What had started as an attempt to gather intelligence for a criminal organization had transformed into an unexpected lesson about the true nature of strength. Cedar Grove was teaching these professional operators that sometimes the most effective resistance isn't in what you do, but in who you are. As night settled over Cedar Grove, the professional contractors hired by Red Hand's leadership faced an unprecedented situation. In their hotel rooms, they pored over tactical maps and surveillance reports, trying to understand how a small town had completely neutralized their operational capabilities. What should have been a simple intimidation and intelligence-gathering mission had turned into a professional embarrassment. "Sir," Captain Rivera reported to Marcus, monitoring encrypted communications, "they're calling in specialist teams now, former Tier 1 operators, surveillance experts. They're treating this like a major military operation." In his command center, Marcus studied the patterns of contractor movements across town. Each attempted surveillance position, every planned observation post, had been rendered useless by the seemingly random but perfectly timed activities of Cedar Grove's residents. "You know what they don't understand, Jack?" Marcus asked, watching another contractor team relocate after finding their position compromised by an impromptu neighborhood watch meeting. "They're trying to fight a battle against tactics, but they're actually facing something much more powerful: community instinct." At Sunrise Café, Grace maintained her evening service while Detective Chen coordinated with federal agencies. Through the windows, she could see more suspicious vehicles arriving, high-end SUVs and unmarked vans that screamed, "professional operation." But each vehicle found itself subtly contained by the town's natural rhythms. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Chen approached with fresh intelligence, "we've identified their command element. Former military intelligence officers, private security specialists. They're setting up a coordinated surveillance operation, or at least trying to." Grace continued serving her regular customers, many of whom now carried concealed notes and observations to share with law enforcement. "They still think this is about tactics," she replied, watching as another contractor team found their observation post blocked by an impromptu street fair planning committee. "They don't realize they're fighting against something they can't see or measure." In the police station's interrogation room, Leo Torres provided insights that helped explain the contractors' growing frustration. "We made the same mistake in Red Hand," he told federal agents. "We thought small towns were soft targets because they lack tactical defenses. We never understood that their strength isn't in tactics, it's in relationships." Sarah Cooper arrived with updates from her community patrols. "The contractors are trying new approaches now. They're attempting to blend in, pose as tourists or business travelers, but in a town where everyone knows everyone else, strangers stand out no matter how well they're trained." Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as the contractors' sophisticated operation continued to unravel. "They're used to dealing with security systems, with tactical responses," he explained to Rivera. "But how do you counter a grandmother's bridge club that just happens to meet wherever you try to set up surveillance? How do you defeat a town's natural curiosity about strangers?" Grace's phone buzzed constantly with messages from throughout Cedar Grove. Shop owners sharing observations, parents coordinating after-school activities, neighbors planning impromptu gatherings. What looked like normal community communication was actually an organic intelligence network that no professional operator could penetrate or counter. "It's remarkable," Detective Chen observed, watching the scene unfold. "Every time they try to establish an observation post, something happens. A kid's baseball game, a church committee meeting, a neighborhood cleanup. It's like the whole town instinctively knows where to be." The contractors found their sophisticated equipment rendered nearly useless. Traditional surveillance techniques failed against a community where every casual conversation could carry intelligence, where every friendly wave might be a signal, and where the simple act of being a close-knit town created an impenetrable defense. "Commander," Rivera reported, monitoring tactical communications, They're calling this operation Ghost Town, but they're the ones who can't maintain any presence here. Every time they think they've found a secure position, the town's natural activity forces them to move. Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as another team of contractors attempted to establish surveillance, only to find themselves surrounded by an impromptu community yoga class in the park across the street. Each failed attempt revealed another layer of Cedar Grove's unconscious coordination. "You know what I've realized?" Grace asked Detective Chen, serving fresh coffee to a group of veterans who had made her cafe their evening headquarters. They came here thinking they could intimidate a single mother, use her business to gain control. Instead, they've awakened something they can't fight: a town's natural instinct to protect its own. As the night deepened, Cedar Grove continued its evening routines, each normal activity unconsciously contributing to the community's defense. Book clubs became intelligence-sharing networks, evening walks turned into patrol routes, and friendly gatherings served as surveillance countermeasures. The professional contractors, trained for every type of tactical situation, found themselves helpless against a form of resistance they couldn't combat: the natural solidarity of a small town where everyone knew everyone else, where unusual activity was instantly noticed and casually countered, and where the simple act of being a community had become the strongest possible defense. What had started as an attempt to gather intelligence for a criminal organization had transformed into an unexpected lesson about the true nature of strength. Cedar Grove was teaching these professional operators that sometimes the most effective resistance isn't in what you do, but in who you are together. Marcus watched through surveillance feeds as another contractor team gave up their position, frustrated by the constant, friendly interference of everyday town life. "You know what's really happening here?" he asked Rivera. "They're learning what my sister already knew, that true strength isn't in power or tactics, but in the unbreakable bonds between neighbors who look out for each other." The late evening hours brought a new intensity to Cedar Grove as the professional contractors attempted their most coordinated effort yet. Multiple teams moved simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the town's natural defenses through sheer numbers and professional expertise. But what they found instead was a community whose response seemed to strengthen with each new challenge. In the command center, Marcus Sullivan tracked their movements through a combination of surveillance feeds and real-time reports from his network. "They're getting desperate," he told Captain Rivera, watching as another team's carefully planned operation fell apart in the face of simple community activity. They've never encountered resistance like this before. "Sir," Rivera reported, monitoring encrypted communications, "they're bringing in their elite teams now. Former Delta Force, Navy SEALs, CIA operatives. They're treating this like a major counterinsurgency operation." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. "They still don't understand. You can't counterinsurgency against normalcy. You can't fight tactical battles against community spirit." At Sunrise Café, Grace continued serving her evening customers while Detective Chen coordinated with federal agencies. The cafe had become more than just a command center. It was now a symbol of the community's resistance, a gathering place where information flowed as freely as coffee. "Mrs. Sullivan," an FBI analyst approached with fresh intelligence, "we've intercepted communications from Red Hand's leadership. They're frustrated, confused. Their best operators can't establish any effective surveillance or control in Cedar Grove. They've never seen anything like this." Grace nodded, watching through the windows as another contractor team found their observation post rendered useless by an impromptu community theater rehearsal in the park. "That's because they're looking for something that doesn't exist," she replied. "They're searching for our tactical defense, our organized resistance. They don't understand that our strength is in simply being who we are." In the police station's interrogation room, Leo Torres continued providing insights that helped explain the contractors' mounting frustration. "In Red Hand, we trained for every type of resistance," he told federal agents. "Armed opposition, organized crime, law enforcement. But how do you fight against potluck dinners and neighborhood watch meetings?" Sarah Cooper arrived with updates from her community patrols. "The contractors are trying to adapt, but they can't," she reported. "They're used to dealing with security systems and tactical responses. Instead, they're facing church bake sales and youth sports practices that just happen to block their surveillance points." Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as the contractor's sophisticated operation continued to unravel. They came prepared for a war, he explained to Rivera. Instead, they're facing something much more powerful, a community that turns everyday life into an impenetrable defense. Grace's phone buzzed constantly with updates from throughout Cedar Grove, merchants sharing observations, parents coordinating activities, neighbors planning gatherings. What looked like normal small-town communication was actually an organic intelligence network that no professional operator could penetrate. "It's extraordinary," Detective Chen observed, watching another contractor team relocate after finding their position compromised by a spontaneous street fair planning meeting. They can't establish any kind of operational foothold. Every time they try, the town's natural activity forces them to move. The contractors found their sophisticated equipment and tactical training rendered nearly useless. Traditional surveillance techniques failed against a community where every casual conversation carried intelligence, where every friendly wave might be a signal, and where the simple act of being neighbors created an unbreakable defense. "Commander," Rivera reported, studying tactical displays, "they're calling this Operation Broken Arrow now. But they're the ones who are broken. Their entire tactical playbook is useless here." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as more contractor vehicles arrived, only to find themselves subtly contained by the town's natural rhythms. Each attempted intimidation was met with quiet resistance, each threat countered by community solidarity. "Mom," Kelly called from her homework spot, "Mrs. Johnson's book club is meeting in front of that black SUV again, and Mr. Peterson's veterans group is having another coffee break right where those men in suits were trying to watch our cafe." Grace shared a knowing look with Detective Chen. The professional contractors, trained for every type of tactical situation, were learning a hard lesson about the true nature of community strength. Their sophisticated operations were being defeated not by counter-tactics, but by the simple, unbreakable bonds of small-town life. As night settled more deeply over Cedar Grove, the town continued its evening routines, each normal activity unconsciously contributing to the community's defense. What had started as an attempt to intimidate a single mother had evolved into something unprecedented, a demonstration of how true strength comes not from power or tactics, but from the unshakable connections between neighbors who look out for each other. The professional contractors found themselves facing something their training hadn't prepared them for, a town where every resident was a potential sensor, every business a potential observation post, and every friendly conversation could be carrying intelligence to law enforcement. Cedar Grove was teaching these elite operators an expensive lesson about the true nature of power. Marcus watched through surveillance feeds as another contractor team abandoned their position, frustrated by the constant, friendly interference of everyday town life. "You know what's really happening here?" he asked Rivera. "They're learning what my sister already knew, that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or tactics, but in the unbreakable spirit of a community that stands together." What had begun as a criminal organization's attempt to control a small town had transformed into something none of them expected, a powerful demonstration that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in force or fear, but in the simple, unshakable bonds of community life. As midnight approached, Cedar Grove witnessed an unprecedented escalation in the contractors' operations. Black SUVs converged on the town from multiple directions, their occupants among the most elite operators money could buy. In their command vehicle, parked discreetly on the outskirts of town, the contractors' leadership reviewed their increasingly frustrated reports. "Sir," Captain Rivera reported to Marcus, monitoring encrypted communications, "they're mobilizing everything they have. 3 former Delta Force teams, ex-CIA operatives, private military contractors from 4 different companies. They're treating Cedar Grove like a military objective." In his command center, Marcus tracked the movements of over 24 professional operators attempting to establish control over a small town that seemed to slip through their fingers like smoke. "They're still fighting the wrong battle," he observed, watching another team's carefully planned operation dissolve in the face of ordinary community life. At Sunrise Café, now operating well past its normal closing time, Grace continued serving coffee to a mix of federal agents, local law enforcement, and regular customers. The cafe had become more than just a target or a command center. It was now a symbol of community resistance. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Chen approached with fresh intelligence. They're implementing what they call Operation Total Control. Multiple teams, simultaneous actions, attempting to overwhelm our community response through sheer numbers and professional expertise. Grace nodded, watching through the windows as another group of contractors found their surveillance position rendered useless by an impromptu midnight prayer vigil at the church across the street. They still don't understand what they're really fighting against, do they? In the station situation room, Leo Torres provided critical insights into the contractors' mounting frustration. These are some of the best operators in the world, he explained to federal agents. They've conducted operations in war zones, urban environments, hostile territories. But they've never faced anything like this, a town where every normal activity becomes a counter-surveillance measure. Sarah Cooper arrived with updates from her community patrols. The contractors are trying to establish a perimeter around key locations, she reported. But every time they set up, something happens. A late-night dog-walking group, an emergency neighborhood watch meeting, even a midnight baking class at the community center. Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as the contractors' sophisticated operation continued to unravel. They've brought in their best people, he told Rivera, but they're learning what Red Hand learned. You can't intimidate a community that turns everyday life into a defense strategy. Grace's phone buzzed with messages from throughout Cedar Grove. Residents reporting suspicious vehicles, sharing observations, coordinating their normal activities in ways that just happened to disrupt the contractors' operations. What looked like ordinary small-town communication was actually an organic intelligence network that no professional operator could penetrate. It's remarkable, Detective Chen observed, watching another team of contractors relocate after finding their position compromised by an impromptu stargazing club meeting. They have state-of-the-art equipment, years of tactical experience, and they're being defeated by book clubs and bake sales. The contractors found their sophisticated surveillance equipment rendered useless by the most ordinary of town activities. Traditional tactical advantages meant nothing in an environment where every casual conversation could be carrying intelligence, where every friendly wave might be a signal, and where the simple act of being neighbors created an impenetrable defense. Commander, Rivera reported, studying tactical displays. They're calling this a black zone now, an area where normal operational protocols don't work. Their entire tactical playbook is being rewritten by a small-town social calendar. Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as more contractor vehicles arrived, only to find themselves subtly contained by the town's natural rhythms. Each attempted intimidation was met with quiet resistance, each threat countered by community solidarity that seemed as natural as breathing. "Mom," Kelly whispered from her makeshift bed on the cafe couch. "Mr. Dawson says the bad guys are getting really mad because they can't figure out how we're stopping them. But we're just being normal, aren't we?" Grace shared a knowing look with Detective Chen. The professional contractors, trained for every type of tactical situation, were learning a hard lesson about the true nature of community strength. Their sophisticated operations were being defeated not by counter-tactics, but by the simple, unbreakable bonds of small-town life. As the night grew deeper, Cedar Grove continued its seemingly ordinary routines, each normal activity unconsciously contributing to the community's defense. What had started as an attempt to intimidate a single mother had evolved into something unprecedented, a demonstration of how true strength comes not from power or tactics, but from the unshakable connections between neighbors who look out for each other. The professional contractors found themselves facing something their training hadn't prepared them for, a town where every resident was a potential sensor, every business a potential observation post, and every friendly conversation could be carrying intelligence to law enforcement. Cedar Grove was teaching these elite operators an expensive lesson about the true nature of power. Marcus watched through surveillance feeds as another contractor team abandoned their position, frustrated by the constant, friendly interference of everyday town life. "You know what's really happening here?" he asked Rivera. "They're learning what my sister already knew, that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or tactics, but in the unbreakable spirit of a community that stands together." What had begun as a criminal organization's attempt to control a small town had transformed into something none of them expected. A powerful demonstration that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in force or fear, but in the simple, unshakable bonds of community life. And as midnight passed into early morning, Cedar Grove continued its quiet resistance, teaching professional operators a lesson they'd never forget about the true nature of power. The first hours of morning brought a new intensity to Cedar Grove, as the contractors launched what they believed would be their decisive operation. Multiple teams moved simultaneously, coordinating their efforts with military precision, determined to finally establish control over a town that had humbled some of the world's most elite operators. "Sir," Captain Rivera reported to Marcus, monitoring encrypted communications. "They're initiating what they're calling Operation Dawn Strike. All teams moving at once, attempting to overwhelm the town's natural defenses through synchronized action." In his command center, Marcus tracked the movements of over 30 professional operators, all executing a carefully planned operation that had taken hours to coordinate. "They still think this is about tactics," he observed, watching their movements across multiple screens. "They haven't realized that they're fighting against something they can't see or measure." At Sunrise Café, Grace prepared for her usual early morning opening, though now it carried a different significance. Through the windows, she could see contractors taking up positions with practiced efficiency, their movements betraying years of special operations training. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Chen approached with fresh intelligence. "They're implementing a full-spectrum approach: surveillance teams, infiltration units, even psychological operations specialists. They're treating Cedar Grove like a military objective that needs to be subdued." Grace continued her morning preparations, the familiar routine of starting coffee and preparing pastries carrying new meaning. "They've brought their best people, their most sophisticated equipment," she remarked, watching another team take position. "But they're still making the same mistake." In the police station's command room, Leo Torres provided insights that helped explain the contractors' increasingly desperate measures. "These operators," he told federal agents, "they're used to dealing with active resistance, with counter-surveillance, with tactical opposition. But how do you fight against a town that defeats you just by going about its daily life?" Sarah Cooper arrived with updates from her early morning patrol. "The contractors have established what they think is a perfect tactical grid," she reported. "But watch what happens when the town wakes up. Every normal morning activity will disrupt their carefully planned operation." Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as the first signs of Cedar Grove's morning routine began to emerge. "They've positioned their teams perfectly," he told Rivera. "By military standards, their operation is flawless. But they're about to learn that perfect tactics mean nothing against community spirit." Grace's phone buzzed with the first messages of the day. Early risers reporting suspicious vehicles, sharing observations, coordinating their morning activities in ways that would naturally disrupt the contractors' positions. The organic intelligence network that had frustrated professional operators was awakening with the town. "It's fascinating," Detective Chen observed, watching the contractors' operation begin to fray as Cedar Grove came to life. "They spent all night planning this, positioning their teams with military precision. And it's all going to fall apart because of normal morning routines." The contractors found their sophisticated equipment and tactical positions compromised by the most mundane activities. Early morning joggers, dog walkers, delivery trucks, and newspaper carriers, each normal part of Cedar Grove's wake-up routine, naturally disrupted their carefully planned surveillance grid. "Commander," Rivera reported, studying tactical displays, "their command element is getting frustrated. They can't maintain their positions as the town wakes up. Every perfect surveillance post becomes unusable as soon as normal activities begin." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as more contractor teams arrived, only to find their carefully chosen positions rendered ineffective by the natural flow of small-town life. Each attempt to establish control was met with the simple, unbeatable resistance of ordinary people going about their daily routines. "You know what they don't understand?" Grace asked Detective Chen, preparing the day's first batch of cinnamon rolls. "They think we're actively fighting them, that we've organized some kind of resistance. They can't grasp that we're just being who we are." As dawn broke fully over Cedar Grove, the contractors' operation began to unravel in ways their training had never prepared them for. Perfect tactical positions became unusable as early morning yoga classes filled the park. Surveillance posts were compromised by senior citizens gathering for their morning coffee walks. Infiltration routes were blocked by parents walking their children to school. "Sir," Rivera reported to Marcus, "their command element is calling it a tactical impossibility. They've never seen anything like this. A town that defeats professional operators just by waking up and starting its day." What had been planned as a decisive military-style operation was transforming into another lesson about the true nature of community strength. The contractors, some of the most highly trained operators in the world, found themselves helpless against the simple, unbeatable power of small-town life. Marcus watched through surveillance feeds as another contractor team abandoned their position, frustrated by the constant, friendly interference of Cedar Grove's morning routine. "You know what's really happening?" he asked Rivera. "They're learning that sometimes the strongest defense isn't in tactical positions or sophisticated equipment, but in the natural rhythms of a community that looks out for its own." As the morning sun rose higher, Cedar Grove continued its peaceful resistance, teaching elite operators an expensive lesson about the true nature of power. What had begun as an attempt to control a small town had become a demonstration that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in force or training, but in the simple, unshakable bonds of everyday life. As the morning sun rose higher, Cedar Grove continued its peaceful resistance, teaching elite operators an expensive lesson about the true nature of power. What had begun as an attempt to control a small town had become a demonstration that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in force or training, but in the simple, unshakable bonds of everyday life. In the command center, Detective Chen watched the scene unfold with growing appreciation. "You know what's remarkable?" she asked Grace through their secure line. "These contractors have conducted operations in some of the world's most dangerous places, yet they're being completely neutralized by a small town's morning routine. It's not just about the activities disrupting their positions. It's about the fundamental power of community itself." Grace smiled, pulling another batch of cinnamon rolls from the oven as early morning customers began to arrive. "That's exactly what they don't understand," she replied. "You can't fight against who people are at their core. And at our core, Cedar Grove is a community that stands together, whether we're facing down criminals or just starting another ordinary day." As morning shifted into midday, the contractor's operation faced its final decisive failure. Their command vehicle, hidden on the outskirts of town, buzzed with increasingly frustrated communications as every attempt to establish control over Cedar Grove met with the same peaceful, unbeatable resistance. "Sir," Captain Rivera reported to Marcus, monitoring encrypted channels, "they're initiating what they're calling Operation Final Strike. Their command element is authorizing direct action. They're dropping the subtle approach entirely." In his command center, Marcus watched as multiple teams of contractors began moving with new purpose, their movements showing the aggression of operators who had abandoned precision for force. "They've finally broken," he observed. "They're about to make their biggest mistake yet." At Sunrise Café, Grace maintained her usual lunch service while Detective Chen coordinated with federal agencies. Through the windows, she could see contractors moving more openly now, their frustration evident in their aggressive postures and direct approaches. Mrs. Sullivan, an FBI tactical specialist, approached with urgent intelligence. "They're shifting to intimidation tactics, direct confrontation. They think if they can't control the town through surveillance, they can do it through fear." Grace continued serving her customers, her movements calm and deliberate. "They still don't understand," she replied, watching another team of contractors take up aggressive positions outside. "Fear only works when people feel alone. But in Cedar Grove, nobody is ever alone." In the police station's command room, Leo Torres provided crucial insights into the contractor's new strategy. "This is exactly what happened with Red Hand," he told federal agents. "When subtle tactics fail, they resort to force, but they don't realize they're playing right into the community's strength." Sarah Cooper arrived with urgent updates from her patrols. "The contractors are moving in force now," she reported. "They're trying to establish visible presence, show of force, but watch how the town responds." Marcus coordinated responses through secure channels, watching as Cedar Grove's natural defense mechanisms activated in new ways. "They think showing force will break the town's resistance," he told Rivera. "Instead, they're about to witness something extraordinary." Grace's phone buzzed constantly with messages from throughout the community. Residents reporting contractor movements, coordinating responses, organizing spontaneous gatherings wherever the operators tried to establish dominance. The organic intelligence network that had frustrated their surveillance was now actively countering their intimidation attempts. "It's amazing," Detective Chen observed, watching the community's response unfold. "Every time they try to intimidate one part of town, people from other neighborhoods show up. Church groups, sports teams, book clubs, everyone's coming together." The contractors found their show of force met with something they'd never encountered, a community that responded to intimidation by drawing closer together. Every aggressive action on their part was met with peaceful gathering of residents, turning their attempts at intimidation into impromptu block parties and community meetings. "Commander," Rivera reported, studying tactical displays. "Their command element is in chaos. They can't understand why increased pressure is resulting in stronger resistance. Every attempt to divide and control is having the opposite effect." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as another team of contractors attempted to establish a threatening presence, only to find themselves surrounded by a spontaneous community farmers market that sprang up around them. Each attempt at intimidation was transformed into an opportunity for the town to demonstrate its unity. "Mom," Kelly called from behind the counter where she was helping serve lunch. "Look at how many people are coming to the cafe now. The more those men try to scare us, the more everyone wants to be together." In the command center, Marcus tracked the contractors' increasingly desperate movements. "They're making the classic mistake," he told Rivera. "They think fear divides people, but in a real community threat brings people closer together." As the contractors escalated their show of force, Cedar Grove responded with an escalation of community. Every aggressive patrol was met with friendly gatherings. Each attempt at intimidation sparked spontaneous neighborhood events. The town's natural defense mechanisms were transforming threat into unity. "Sir," Rivera reported, monitoring communications, "their command element is calling it a tactical paradox. The more pressure they apply, the stronger the community resistance becomes. They've never seen anything like it." Grace continued serving lunch to an ever-growing crowd as more residents came to show their support. The cafe had become more than just a target or a symbol. It was now the heart of the community's peaceful resistance against intimidation. Detective Chen watched the scene with professional appreciation. "You know what's really happening here?" she asked Grace. "They thought they could break the town's spirit through force. Instead, they're making it stronger with every attempt." As the contractor's operation continued to backfire, Cedar Grove demonstrated a fundamental truth about the nature of community strength. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate through force had transformed into a powerful demonstration that true strength lies not in the ability to threaten, but in the power to bring people together. Marcus watched through surveillance feeds as another contractor team withdrew, their show of force rendered meaningless by the peaceful gathering of neighbors. "They're learning the hardest lesson," he told Rivera. "You can't defeat a community that turns threat into unity, that transforms intimidation into celebration of togetherness." The contractor's final operation was becoming their greatest failure, teaching them an expensive lesson about the true nature of power. In trying to break Cedar Grove through force, they had instead sparked a demonstration of community strength that would be remembered for years to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Grove as the contractor's operation reached its final desperate phase. In their command vehicle, the leadership faced an unprecedented situation. Their elite teams, comprised of some of the world's most experienced operators, had been completely defeated not by countertactics or armed resistance, but by the simple, unbeatable power of community. "Sir," Captain Rivera reported to Marcus, monitoring the last encrypted communications, "they're initiating total withdrawal. Their command element is calling it a complete operational failure. They've never encountered anything like this in their entire careers." In his command center, Marcus watched as the contractors began their systematic retreat from Cedar Grove. What had started as an attempt to intimidate a single mother had transformed into a powerful lesson about the true nature of strength. "You know what they never understood, Jack?" Marcus asked Rivera, tracking the contractor's withdrawal. "They came here thinking they were facing a tactical challenge. Instead, they encountered something their training never prepared them for: the power of a community that turns threat into unity." At Sunrise Café, Grace maintained her afternoon service while Detective Chen coordinated with federal agencies. Through the windows, she could see contractors pulling back from their positions, their defeat evident in their frustrated movements and defensive postures. Mrs. Sullivan, an FBI analyst, approached with final intelligence reports. "We're seeing similar withdrawals across 3 states. Red Hand's entire operation is collapsing. What happened here in Cedar Grove? It's having a domino effect on their entire organization." Grace continued serving her customers, the cafe now filled with a mix of regular patrons, law enforcement, and community members who had made it their gathering point throughout the crisis. "They thought they could use fear to control us," she reflected. "Instead, they learned that fear only works when people feel isolated." In the police station's command room, Leo Torres provided insights into the broader implications of what had happened. "This isn't just about one operation failing," he told federal agents. "What Cedar Grove demonstrated here, it's going to change how these organizations think about small towns completely." Sarah Cooper arrived with updates from her final patrols. "The contractors are pulling out entirely," she reported. "But watch how the town is responding. People aren't celebrating like it's a victory. They're just continuing their normal routines, like this was all just another day in Cedar Grove." Marcus coordinated through secure channels, watching as the professional operators who had tried to subdue the town made their final retreat. "They came here thinking they could break the community through force," he told Rivera. "Instead, the community broke them through unity." Grace's phone buzzed with messages from throughout Cedar Grove, residents reporting the contractor's withdrawal, sharing observations, maintaining their network of awareness that had proven unbeatable. What had developed as a defense mechanism had become a stronger sense of community connection. "It's remarkable," Detective Chen observed, watching the scene unfold. "These contractors have operated in war zones, handled high-threat situations worldwide. But they were completely defeated by neighborhood watch meetings and impromptu community gatherings. The contractors found their withdrawal as challenging as their operation, with every attempt at a tactical retreat compromised by the town's natural rhythms. Church groups held outdoor services near their exit routes, school sports practices sprang up along their planned paths, and community events seemingly materialized wherever they tried to establish rally points. "Commander," Rivera reported, studying the final tactical displays, "their after-action reports are unprecedented. They're documenting complete tactical failure against non-traditional community-based resistance. This is going to change their entire operational doctrine." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as the last contractor teams pulled out, their sophisticated operation thoroughly defeated by the simple power of small-town life. Each aggressive tactic they had employed had been transformed into an opportunity for the community to grow stronger. "Mom," Kelly said, helping clean up after the busy day, "Mr. Dawson says we didn't just beat the bad guys. We showed them a better way. Some of them looked like they wished they could stay." In the command center, Marcus tracked the final movements of the contractors. "You know what really happened here?" he asked Rivera. "We didn't just defeat an operation. Cedar Grove demonstrated something that these professional operators had forgotten: that true strength comes from bringing people together, not driving them apart." As the contractors completed their withdrawal, Cedar Grove continued its normal routines, though now there was a deeper awareness in every interaction. What had started as a response to threat had evolved into a stronger sense of community, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from showing them a better way. "Sir," Rivera reported, monitoring the last communications. "Some of the contractors, and especially the veterans among them, are requesting contact information for veteran support services. Seems like what they witnessed here affected them deeply." Grace continued serving her last customers of the day, the cafe still buzzing with the energy of a community that had discovered its true strength. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate a single mother had transformed into a powerful demonstration of how unity defeats force, how community overcomes intimidation. As evening approached, Cedar Grove settled into its normal patterns, though now every interaction carried new meaning. The town had faced down professional operators, criminal organizations, and sophisticated tactical operations, emerging stronger not through force or resistance, but through the simple, unbeatable power of being a true community. The evening sun painted Cedar Grove in shades of gold as the town settled into a new normal. At Sunrise Café, Grace Sullivan served the last customers of the day, though now each interaction carried deeper meaning. What had begun as a criminal organization's attempt to intimidate a single mother had transformed into something extraordinary, a powerful demonstration of community strength that would be remembered for years to come. Mrs. Sullivan, Detective Chen approached with final reports in hand. The FBI just confirmed it. Red Hand's entire operation is collapsing across 3 states. What happened here in Cedar Grove, it triggered a chain reaction. Their whole criminal empire is falling apart. In his command center, Marcus Sullivan reviewed the final intelligence summaries with Captain Rivera. The screens that had tracked contractor movements now showed a broader picture. Criminal organizations withdrawing from small towns across the region, their carefully built networks of intimidation crumbling in the face of Cedar Grove's example. "Sir," Rivera reported, reviewing the last updates, "we're seeing something unprecedented. Other communities are adopting what they're calling the Cedar Grove model. Small towns are transforming their normal routines into defense networks. It's spreading like wildfire." Through the cafe windows, Grace watched as the last federal vehicles departed, leaving Cedar Grove to its peaceful evening rhythms. The town had changed, not in its appearance or daily routines, but in its understanding of its own strength. "You know what really happened here?" she asked Detective Chen, serving fresh coffee to the remaining customers. "We didn't just stop criminals or defeat operators. We showed people that true strength isn't about force or fear. It's about standing together." In the police station's final briefing room, Leo Torres provided insights that would shape law enforcement approaches for years to come. What Cedar Grove demonstrated, he told federal agents, isn't just about community defense. It's about transforming the very nature of security. They showed that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or tactics, it's in the bonds between neighbors. Sarah Cooper arrived with her final patrol report. "The town's already adapting," she observed. "Those community networks that formed during the crisis, they're becoming permanent. People aren't going back to the way things were. They're building something better." Marcus coordinated the last phases of the operation through secure channels, watching as Cedar Grove's example rippled outward. "They came here thinking they could exploit small-town values," he told Rivera. "Instead, those values became their undoing." Grace's phone buzzed with messages that now carried new significance. Not just neighbors sharing information, but a community consciously maintaining the connections that had proven unbeatable. What had developed as a response to threat had become a way of life. "Mom," Kelly said, helping with the final cleanup, "my teacher says what happened here is going to be in history books. But we were just being ourselves, weren't we?" Grace hugged her daughter close. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be who you are, especially when others try to make you afraid." The evening deepened as Cedar Grove settled into its new awareness. The town had faced down professional operators, criminal organizations, and sophisticated tactical operations, emerging stronger not through force or resistance, but through the simple, unbeatable power of community unity. "Commander," Rivera reported, reviewing final assessments, "the intelligence community is already studying what happened here. They're calling it a paradigm shift in understanding community resilience." Detective Chen watched as the last federal agents packed up their equipment. "You know what's remarkable?" she asked Grace. "Other towns might try to copy what happened here, but they'll miss the most important part. This wasn't about tactics or strategies. It was about being true to who you are." As night fell, Marcus made his final coordination calls, ensuring that the lessons of Cedar Grove would be properly understood and shared. "What happened here," he told Rivera, "isn't just about defeating criminals. It's about remembering what makes communities strong in the first place." The cafe's last customers lingered, their conversations carrying tones of both reflection and determination. Cedar Grove had demonstrated something profound about the nature of strength, showing that sometimes the greatest power lies not in the ability to fight, but in the choice to stand together. "You know what they never understood?" Grace asked Chen as they watched the sunset. "They thought they were fighting against a town. But you can't fight against community spirit. You can't intimidate people who refuse to be afraid because they know they're not alone." As stars began to appear over Cedar Grove, the town settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, though now each interaction, each friendly wave, each casual conversation carried deeper meaning. What had started as a criminal organization's attempt to exploit a small town had transformed into a powerful reminder of what makes communities truly strong. The lessons of Cedar Grove would spread, inspiring other towns to rediscover their own strength. But those who tried to replicate its success would learn that true community resilience isn't about copying tactics or strategies. It's about nurturing the bonds between neighbors, about choosing unity over fear, about standing together in the face of intimidation. As Grace locked up the cafe for the night, she looked out over her peaceful town with new appreciation. Cedar Grove had faced its greatest challenge not by becoming something different, but by being more truly itself. In doing so, it had demonstrated that sometimes the strongest defense isn't in walls or weapons, but in the unshakable bonds between people who choose to stand together. The night settled over Cedar Grove, wrapping the town in peaceful darkness. But now that peace carried new meaning, not the peace of isolation or fear, but the deep, unshakable peace of a community that had discovered its true strength and would never forget it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.